This is the first lecture in Seminar in Corrections, CJ568. And I wanted to take this opportunity to provide you with some background information or some context in terms of what you're reading this week. Before we can talk about corrections, we've got to understand the context within which it exists. Corrections as a discipline or as a practice did not drop out of the sky in the 1970s. In fact, it's been around for a very long time, and it is the culmination of a series of ideas and, quite frankly, some mistakes. We find ourselves in the pickle we are in precisely because we have not learned from past mistakes and we have not changed the way we do business. In our efforts to get tough on crime, we have backed ourselves into a corner. Our current system is overcrowded, our current system is not effective, and if you don't believe me, look at recidivism rates of approximately 66% over three years after release for confirmation. And moreover, our system continues to make bad investments. We invest far greater resources in institutional correctional facilities than we do in community corrections. At the end of the day, we incarcerate more people per capita than any other industrialized nation. We have higher crime rates than any other industrialized nation, and we make far fewer attempts than any other industrialized nation to reduce crime. This course will attempt to expand your knowledge of corrections in some fundamental ways. Your text for this class is actually a reader comprised of primary source materials on cogent issues in corrections. While there are additional articles for you to read as well, I think the primary source materials provide you with some particular insight that some of the seminal thinkers in corrections were writing about, thinking about, and concerns that still plague the system today. As you will no doubt observe, everything old is new again, and history repeats itself. And while these are trite sayings, unfortunately, in the field of criminal justice, they are very, sadly, true. The readings I've assigned to you this week really drill down into some of the fundamental corrections issues. What is the purpose of punishment, for instance? Because if one does not understand that, how can one understand the purpose of corrections? And when one actually begins reading about the purpose of punishment in some detail, the purpose becomes cloudy. It is not clear. And generally, there is not one purpose to anything, let alone the reasons why someone may or may not be sentenced to prison time. In an effort to get you to really think about this, I am taking you far back in time to the feudal system and views of corporal punishment. The Sperenberg article does an outstanding job of explaining how the critical shift from corporal to carceral punishment occurred. This may not make sense to you now, but read the article carefully. As you will see, when we shifted from punishment of the soul to punishment of the body, significant changes in punishment management occurred. This article highlights the absolute need for people studying and thinking about corrections, and anything else for that matter, to consider the larger period, considering the larger social, ideological context of events in understanding anything we study. David Rothman's work on the discovery of the asylum essentially picks up where Sperenberg leaves off. Where Sperenberg talks about changes in punishment on a more global scale, Rothman discusses these issues as they relate to the United States. By way of background, Rothman is a historian by trade, and what makes his account of the rise of the penitentiary so appealing and intriguing is that he, again, puts the story in some larger context. Be sure to relate the Sperenberg and Rothman articles to the Bosch article on Alexis de Tocqueville, a Frenchman who came to the United States in the 1800s to tour the latest advancement in corrections thinking at the time, the prison. Celine's article on prison history should serve to reinforce the notion that the world does not function in a vacuum, and that the shift from corporal to carceral punishment was actually a very significant event in the history of corrections and prisons. Yes, prisons were created as a result of this shift, but he brings up a concept that is reinforced over and over again in corrections and criminal justice in general, this notion of unintended consequences. Unintended consequences are extraordinarily dangerous, if only because they're unintended. In many cases, these consequences are the result of people not properly thinking through what they are doing, laws they are passing, rules they are making. In other cases, unintended consequences are the result of ignorance, people making decisions without all of the information at their disposal. In yet other cases, they are purely unintended and cannot be foreseen. No matter the cause, however, the effect can be devastating. You will see that in this class, but hopefully will note the importance of unintended consequences in other courses you take as well. For example, the unintended consequences of 3 strikes legislation on prison population, or the unintended consequences of overcriminalization on sentencing and community corrections. The article by Travis that you will read focuses on sentencing. Sentencing is a significant concern in corrections because people cannot be sentenced to time in prison, or probation for that matter, unless the statutes of the jurisdiction allow it. Therefore, sentencing is important. Some jurisdictions are more lenient than others. For example, some jurisdictions allow judges much greater leeway in sentencing people to probation or prison than others. That can be good or bad. In Texas, virtually every felony is punishable from probation to life in prison. This allows judges significant discretion in how they sentence people, and therefore allows for much greater disparity in sentencing. 2 people, all else being equal, one might be sentenced to probation and the other might be sentenced to prison time for the same crime. Discretion can be a good and a bad thing. It's all in how it's used. This is in part what is attributed to the penal harm movement that Cullen describes in his article. Unsure about where to discuss it in this lecture, I want to make specific mention of the article by Rafter on the evolution and development of women's prisons. While historically women have not garnered much attention in the empirical research literature, they are a very important facet of the criminal justice system and corrections policy and practice in contemporary America. And it's important to understand how their corrections experience differs from men. Where part 1 of your text has explored corrections from an historical perspective, readings 29 and 30 are contemporary reflections on where we are in corrections in the United States today. There are real issues with incarcerating large numbers of people, mostly that large numbers of people will eventually leave prison and return to a community near you and me, and will be no better prepared for success on the outside than they were when they went into prison, and in most cases, less prepared than ever. The Pew Center report does an outstanding job of explaining exactly how. The final article that you've been asked to read this week has to do with failed drug policy and the war on drugs. The war on drugs has been unsuccessful on many fronts, but I will mention only one. When you sentence people to prison for long periods of time for carrying relatively small amounts of drugs, you fill your prison cells with people who will not benefit from your punishment. Most of the people in prison for long drug sentences are low-level offenders, prostitutes, or others who are dealing to try to make a living. Now, that does not make their behavior right, moral, or legal, but they are not the drug cartels and high-level drug dealers that the laws were created to target. And so we end where we began, except that I am hopeful that you now have a much better understanding of the genesis of correctional theory and ideology, and recognize that the evolution and development of corrections in the United States is complicated and multifaceted. There is not one trajectory or issue that impacts corrections policy and practice. There are a multitude of issues, from theory to politics, that play significant roles in the way in which corrections is perceived and plays out in our modern-day correctional system.